Hi guys, let me preface this video by saying measuring the friction properties of mousepads is not as straightforward as you might think, or I thought first. There are many factors that affect the glide on the mousepad, like the surface, the base, the skates you use, how worn in those skates are, how dirty your pad is, how humid and warm it is in your room, do you have static electricity built up in your pad, etc. And also how you grip your mouse and how heavy-handed you are at that current date. Therefore, I must admit I overlooked some things in my previous testing and some things in my testing were not optimal. So this time around I made some changes to my methods. The change number one is that I now ditch the additional weight on top of the mouse. I previously thought that would make the testing more applicable to normal use, but things are not as simple as I thought. You see, the amount of force you put on your mouse changes person to person with a quite large margin. You even might have a stiff neck on that particular date and therefore you might exert more pressure on your mouse. The additional weight also affects different mousepads quite differently because the base softness and the material starts to play a big role in the results the more weight is applied to the mouse. So this time I measured the results without the weight on top of the mouse and with a significantly lighter mouse than previously, the Gevels HDX. Another difference in this testing is that I used the X-Ray Pad J dot skates instead of the trusty old core pads. A lot of people have transferred to using dot skates on their mice recently, I included, and I found more consistency on my results with the dots applied. So for the measurements I used this Chinese brand digital force meter with also dots applied. I placed the mousepad on an even surface, which is my desk of course, and then pushed the mouse with the digital meter so it started to move. And I then noted down the peak force from that moment that the measuring device can capture. For dynamic friction, some human error is more present. For that, I pushed the mouse with a constant force and noted down the value the meter showed during that run. Note that the value jumps between numbers a lot since it is not humanly possible to have 100% consistency with these push runs, but enough runs and I got a good feeling for the force I needed for the measurements. I repeated the static friction test 7 times for each mousepad, removed 2 of the outliers, so the smallest and the highest value from the dataset, and calculated the average. For dynamic friction, I measured 5 times per mousepad and removed the 2 outliers as well. Then I also calculated the friction coefficient from these values and with the gravitational force of the mouse taken into account, of course. So here are the results in a neat Google Forms format that is more easily readable than before, and the list is now sorted by the dynamic friction value, so some pads might have a higher static number but still be faster than others on the list. I also put some additional fields to describe the surface material and the softness of the whole pad. So the softness is not just the base, which means that the Hien XSoft is not listed as XSoft and rather is listed as soft. So I have left the link to this spreadsheet in the description, so take a look if you want. But now let's discuss some interesting details about the new results and one particular pad that really changed from the previous testing runs. So the pad that had its values pretty much turned upside down is the Freefall SV BASE Control Plus. It is a very much loved pad from the Freefall manufacturing group that is truly unique. It has their extremely hard custom silicone base with a jacquard weave fabric on top, and build quality wise it's just top notch. In my previous testing where the additional weight was used, this pad measured out surprisingly slow and it appeared to have a really high static friction. But my further testing showed that the pad's friction properties depend greatly with how much pressure you put on your mouse. This is because the base has zero give whatsoever, and together with the fabric, the friction increases exponentially with the amount of force applied to the mouse. As Newton's third law states, whenever one object exerts a force on a second object, the second object exerts an equal and opposite force on the first, and those forces affect the friction values. When the base has some give, the up and down forces applied are not as drastic and the mouse will glide more freely on the pad. In the case of glass pads, it is basically the same thing as with the Freefall pad, so the pad has no give, but glass pads have a much smoother texture, so the friction remains still smaller. And yeah, this pad, based on the new measurements, is much like the Artisan's Hayate Otsu in terms of dynamic friction, but has less static friction without the weight applied. In my opinion, This pad is an extremely good balance pad, and the more I use it, the more I like it. I have been able to concentrate on my static clicking technique with this pad so well, since I can increase the friction so easily by putting more pressure on my mouse. So I can highly recommend this pad, and now I understand why others do as well. Then some words about the Hien XSoft numbers here. The Artisan Hien is a fast pad, but with the XSoft base it transformed to this very controlled experience altogether. This particular Hien is pretty old and I have washed it a few times, so therefore I have marked it down as worn. So if your Hien XSoft is considerably faster, I don't doubt that at all. I used to own the Hien XSoft and it was a lot faster than the XSoft one. But sadly I don't have it anymore, so I couldn't test it with the newer method as well. And then a third pad that needs to be mentioned is the Infinitymice Control V2 Soft that I just recently picked up. It offers what it promises, incredible control, but something that feels quite balanced. There is no noticeable jump in speed after the mouse starts moving, and it just remains very controlled across the whole mouse swipe. It is slightly slower than the Saturn Pro from Lethal Game Gear and has a very similar feeling with the Pulsar ES2, but it is just so good feeling to use. The quality is excellent and the base is just beautifully done with the Infinitymice logos on it. So it is definitely a control pad that I can safely recommend, and especially for the price, you can't get the better control pad than this in my opinion. But yeah, sometime in the future I will look into building a more robust system for the dynamic friction measurements, something that will use a servo motor and I can achieve more accurate measurements. But for now I think the list is pretty much backed up by my real life experiences as well, so I am confident sharing it with the public. Like always, thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Goodbye.